Now, surely a lot of Republicans and so-called conservatives have to be thrilled about the fact that the 2016 presidential election is less than 16 months away. It's less than 16 months away. They know that they can begin the countdown clock on lame duck Obama, and that gives them great reason to celebrate. But they also know the simple fact is that they're also glad that they don't have to run up against him in 2016 because, frankly, the last two times they did that, they got their asses creamed and their clocks cleaned. And that is a simple truth. So now there is new optimism, I think, for Republicans and for conservatives and the GOP establishment as a whole, because they don't have to worry about running up against Obama the candidate or Obama the incumbent president come 2016. And that for the Republican Party, in a way, probably seems like a big significant victory. It's a game changer for them. Because frankly, what the hell else do they have to grab onto? So you hear a lot of Republicans and conservatives, I'm sure, are going to talk about how the GOP can sit there and win this upcoming election, how they can sit there and take this country back, and they could do all of this crap and all of that crap. Apparently, clearly not learning the lessons of 2008 and 2012. They're going to focus on polls that are skewed, measuring registered voters as opposed to likely voters, not giving you a fair representation of the actual voting demographics of the state. They're going to talk about this, they're going to talk about that. But the fact of the matter is, the bottom line is that the GOP doesn't really have the way it stands right now. And granted, there are a lot of variables at play and a lot of things that can change between now and November of 2016. The GOP just really doesn't, frankly, have much of a chance of hell of winning the 2016 presidential election. The map's not there. The facts and evidence just aren't on their side. They might give you the impassioned BS. They might try to spin you and tell you otherwise. But when you live in a place called reality land and you're realistic and you use logic and reason and numbers and statistical evidence to back you up, it's very hard to see any real clear path to the GOP winning the presidency in 2016. It's easy to see just how difficult of a path it's going to be for the GOP. Part of the biggest reason for Obama being able to win by the margins that he did, both in 2008 and even still in 2012 when he was a less than stellarly popular, incumbent president, was that he had a superior ground game, he had a superior infrastructure, he understood how to target specific areas of a state, and within those areas, certain counties, in those counties, certain cities, certain blocks, certain neighborhoods, if you will, certain streets, all of that. The Obama ground game was so superior, especially when it comes to turning out the vote in the ever-important non-white demographics. The electorate in this country is changing, and is changing significantly. Non-white voters are growing in importance. White voters are decreasing in importance. And no matter how much of a problem this is, not so much for Republican voters, but the Republican establishment and the GOP itself, it doesn't change the fact that it's true. You can't just win the white vote and win the White House anymore. And the GOP still seems stuck on that mentality and that philosophy, and they were in 2008 and 2012. And frankly, a lot of the things they do in 2016 lead you to believe they're looking at it the exact same way. I mean, you were running up against a biracial president, which you would have thought would have potentially turned out the white people in great numbers, and you still couldn't beat him. And in fact, both times you got cream. It's because Obama was able to sit there with the black population, who were 13% of the total voters, win close to 95% of them. Hispanics, making up 10% of the electorate. He won over 70% of them. Asians, you throw them in, 3 to 4% of the electorate. He's winning over 70% of them. So you're talking about a little bit over a quarter of all the voters in the 2012 presidential race. Over a quarter. Half of that went over 90% for Obama, and the rest went more than 70% for Obama. So he didn't have to win a whole lot of the white vote, which frankly he didn't. He didn't do horrible, but he certainly didn't do very good, winning, I believe, just over 40% of the total white vote. And he could still win the White House, and win the White House by a big way. Because in particular, what he was able to do was appeal to young voters and then these non-majority voters, if you will, and turn them out in great numbers and in a great majority for him. And especially in these swing states and in key counties and key areas, he was able to clean their clocks. So now you look at 2016 and you say, what's really different? And the answer is not really that much. When you look at the electoral map for 2016 for both parties, the Democrats have a built-in advantage. A lot of people sit there and say that the GOP has an advantage because they have more states in the safe or likely Republican red column. Well, that is true. They have about what I would classify as 20 states that you would say are lock, stock, and barrel locks to vote Republican, no matter if a Republican candidate ever steps foot on their state or not during the entire campaign cycle, or very likely to do so. It would take a disaster on that side of the fence for that not to happen. But the problem is the Republicans, with those 20 states that they have, only 2 of them have more than 10 electoral votes. That's Tennessee and Texas. So out of the gate, you could effectively say the Republicans start off with a base rate of 154 electoral votes. It takes 270 to win. So that means they got to find a way to get 116 more. Whereas the Democrats, where they just have 16 states in Washington, D.C., part of those 16 states include big states, huge states like California, New York, and Illinois, other states of decent size like Washington, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey. I mean, you look at it, and the Democrats are getting more quality as opposed to quantity that the Republicans are. For those 16 states in D.C., you could pretty much honestly, based off of statistics and based off of history, based off of trends even, say that the Democrats have those states pretty well locked up. So you're looking at a baseline for them of electoral votes, unless they get hit by a Mack truck and they have an epic disaster, of 207. Now again, they only need 270 to win the White House. They're at 207. Whereas the Republicans have to find a way to win at least 116, the Democrats have to find a way to win 63. It's not only a little bit of advantage for the Democratic Party, it is a sizable, significant advantage, especially when you look at the remaining what you would classify as swing or toss-up states. Now, for me, when I'm talking about a swing or toss-up state, I'm being somewhat generous, but not necessarily, in terms of I'm throwing in any state for the most part that is 10% or less in the past presidential election or two, where if different things went right to differing degrees, it could swing to one Democratic Party or one to the Republican Party, what have you. There's 14 total toss-up states, meaning a total of 107 potential electoral votes up for grabs. You got Arizona with 11, Colorado with 9, Florida 29, Georgia 16, Iowa 6, Minnesota 10, Missouri 10, North Carolina 15, New Hampshire 4, Nevada 6, Ohio 18, Pennsylvania's 20, Virginia's 13, and Wisconsin's 10. So there's a lot of votes. And a lot of Republican brains and a lot of conservative voters might sit there and say to themselves, and conservative thinkers might sit there and say to themselves, yeah, they start off with a disadvantage, but it's not such a sizable disadvantage where they can't overcome it, where they can't find a way to get to 270 or more. There are so many states potentially in play, more than frankly were in 2012, that they've got a shot. And now that they feel that they at least have a shot, they've got to make the most of their opportunity, and they think they can put together the right ticket to hit those key states that they need to hit in order to win the election in 2016. But the simple truth of the matter is, while there are a lot of what you would classify as toss-up states, it's going to be an incredible hard road for the GOP to hold. It really is. Because when you look at it, Obama was able to shift so much of the electoral map blue in both 2008 and 2012 that out of those 14 states that I mentioned, 10 of them went to Obama in both 2008 and 2012. Both of them. And when you look at it in 2008, he damn near turned Missouri. And you look at it in 2008, he did turn North Carolina. And even when it went back to the Republican column in 2012, it wasn't by a convincing margin in any stretch of the imagination. But 10 of these 14 were Obama in both 2008 and 2012. While Arizona and Georgia and Missouri didn't go to him either time, he damn near got Missouri in 2008. And then in 2012, the margins in both Arizona and Georgia were around 9 to 10%. Actually, a little bit less than that, I believe, in Georgia. And then North Carolina was the only other one. All the rest of them were firm Obama holds in wins in 2008 and holds in 2012. That's not a good place for the GOP to be. They basically have to go in there and try to defeat that Democratic ground game and infrastructure that's been in place over the past, frankly, 8 years in a lot of these toss-up swing states where there is already a built-in Democratic home field advantage. And as we know, just like in sports, home field advantage isn't everything, but it most certainly damn is a very important thing. You'd rather be on the defensive as opposed to the offensive because you could defend your turf a lot easier than you could go take it over. So you'll sit there and hear the Republicans talk about, yeah, well, it was Obama, it was a different set of circumstances and everything else. A lot of these states are going to be back up in play. People aren't going to like Hillary. They're not going to like what Obama did during his 8 years, da-da-da. And they'll point to states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Minnesota as states that Republicans feel that they could potentially put into play. And maybe they could. Maybe to give them credit, they'll find the right combination of a ticket that could actually put these states into play. But the fact that I'm even really throwing these in as toss-up states is really, frankly, being generous. Because, let's face it, Pennsylvania hasn't gone GOP since Bush beat Dukakis in '88. Wisconsin hasn't went GOP since Reagan cleaned Mondale's clock in '84. And Minnesota hasn't gone GOP since Nixon whooped McGovern in 1972. So part of what you're going to hear out of the Republican Party is that they're going to try and put states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota into play, states that haven't been won by the time the 2016 presidential election would have come around, states that haven't been won by the GOP in 28 years, 32 years, and 44 frickin' years. These are some of the states that the GOP are going to be trying to target. These are some of the states the media are going to be trying to sell you as being potentially swing states. And while, yes, maybe the margins have shrunk up just a little bit in states specifically like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, the margin shrinking up is one thing. Actually flipping them to the other column is an entirely different thing. And if you don't have the right ground game, the right strategy, the right infrastructure, and the right message in place, you're not going to flip those states. And that's a fact. So let's sit here and let's be completely generous to the GOP. Let's sit there and say that they can do it, and they can have a chance. All right, I'll entertain your thought here for a second. So let's just say, for sake of argument, just to help illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here, let's take every single toss-up state and throw it into the GOP column for a second, as they could potentially win it. If they did that, if they somehow found a way to win every toss-up state, that would mean they would end up with 331 electoral votes. I'd be absolutely floored and flummoxed if that happened at any time in the near future, whether it's 2016, 20, or beyond. So let's take those 331 electoral votes. Let's throw out Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, because based off of history, it's very likely that even if it's by a small margin, all three of those states, especially strongly Minnesota and maybe a little less strong but still pretty strong Pennsylvania, they're going to stay Democrat. Wisconsin's probably the closest to flux, but again, we're talking about a state that hasn't went GOP in a presidential election since 1984. So take those three states and the 40 total electoral votes out of the mix. That puts the Republicans at 291 electoral votes. 291. Combining that with the fact that the white voting bloc is becoming an ever smaller percentage of the overall voting electorate, and blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, especially blacks and Hispanics specifically, are becoming a growing importance and a growing part of the electorate. How can the GOP sit there and find a way to get to 270? I put all the toss-up states in that column for the sake of demonstrating the point. You take away Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, because frankly, none of those three are really realistic GOP gains. They really aren't. Even if Walker was the candidate with Wisconsin, he wouldn't be guaranteed to win Wisconsin. That puts you at 291 electoral votes. This is how difficult the road to hoe becomes for the GOP. They can't win without winning Florida. Like legitimately. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all go Democrat in 16. If the Republicans lose Florida, that's it. Like literally, there is absolutely no mathematical formula that could get them to 270 electoral votes. So no matter what, the most important state of all for the GOP in 2016 is Florida. They have to flip Florida. No real viable plan of getting to 270 for the Republican Party can really be formulated without finding a way to win Florida, which again has with Democrat the past two presidential elections. In all honesty, the GOP is also going to have to win Ohio and Virginia, states again that the last two elections have both went Democrat. And when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, the Democrats are going to have to target so many states where they're going to have to try and effect change, where they're going to have to change, a 6%, 8%, 9% Democratic advantage to where it could even get into that territory of within a margin of error where it could be really, truly a toss-up and in play. That's going to take a lot of money and a lot of energy, and that's really going to spread the Republicans' resources thin. And I think running that type of strategy would be a big type of mistake. Really, when you look at it, the GOP has about 6 states that they really have to target. And they're the states that they have to focus on the most in order for them to win the presidential election. That's Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. Now, like I said, assuming that a Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota all went Democrat again in 2016, which I think is a very safe assumption based off of history, based off of trends, then you look at it and say, okay, throw Wisconsin out. They've got to win Florida's 29. They have to. So let's start back off with the old number that they had. Let's say 154. So they get Arizona in their 11. That puts them up to 165. They hold Arizona. Then they get Georgia and their 16. That's 165, 16. That's 181. Then they get Missouri's 10. That puts them at 191. You get to Florida, and that puts them at 220. Yes, 220. And then let's say they win Ohio. Get 18. That puts them to 238. Virginia in its 13 will put them to 251. I mean, even when you look at it with those states there, let's say they get Iowa's 6. That puts them at 257. New Hampshire puts them at 261, I believe. They would still have to find a way to win Wisconsin in order to win the presidential election. Because, I could sit there and throw out other combinations and everything else, but the combination that would require the least number of states, or one of the least numbers of states, would then be having them win Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. It's a very small window, so the margin of error for the GOP is very small. Basically, for all intents and purposes, if they lose one of those states out of those 6, Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Iowa, New Hampshire, Wisconsin, they are done. It is a wrap. City, baby, period. Because if they can't win, let's say, in Ohio, then it's probably very likely that they would also lose in Iowa. And that definitely means that they would lose in Wisconsin, and then you can really forget about it. And all the while, the Democrats have a real opportunity here in 2016 to really change the electoral map for a generation. What started under Obama's campaign in 2008 and 2012 can be continued in 2016 and 2020. The Democrats can't rest on their laurels. They can't sit there and present themselves as being out of touch. They can't sit there and just, totally turn off the Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters and fail to get them engaged and fail to ultimately get them to turn out on Election Day. But they have to try and pick their spots as well, not only to defend, which is going to be easier for them to defend because they're already entrenched as the favorites, but they have to find a way to be strategic in terms of the states that they could potentially go after to really put the Republican Party on the defensive. Because like I said, there are all these toss-up states, but the Republicans are going to have to go into these many states, spend that much money to try and win, whereas the Democrats can, again, have that built-in home kind of state advantage, that swing state advantage, and they can play defense. And then put the Republicans on the defensive, spread their resources even thinner by going after some states that the Republican Party for decades, frankly, shouldn't have had to defend. That's Arizona, Georgia, and Missouri. Now, Missouri's always kind of been a swing state. It barely went to McCain in 2008. It went stronger for Romney in 2012. But if you get a candidate that appeals a little more to white working class voters, and in particular white women, Missouri's right back up as the true type of show me state toss-up that it's always been viewed as throughout presidential election history. The Democrats have to go after Missouri, and they have to go at it hard. They've got to go after Georgia because, again, that's a state with an electorate that, isn't just totally dominated. It's still majority white, but the non-white elements are bigger. They vote so big and break so big for the Democratic Party. Again, if you can find a candidate that appeals to more of those white working class males and white women, you can really put Georgia into play. It's already starting to get into play. And then you look at a state like Arizona, especially if you have a Republican candidate that doesn't appeal all that well to Hispanics, can't really get their message to resonate in a state like Arizona. A state like Arizona that the Republicans have had to defend, frankly, a little bit more than they should have the past two presidential elections could really go into play come 2016. And you look at it from a swing state standpoint. If the Democrats were able to sit there and make Arizona super competitive and perhaps flip Arizona, you know that they're going to get Nevada and Colorado. Because those are states where they've won the last two times. If they could flip Arizona, how the hell would they not be able to win Colorado and Nevada? If they win Georgia, let's say, you know they're probably going to be able, if they can win Georgia, you know they'll win Florida, and that probably means they'll also win not only Virginia but North Carolina as well. And then if they win Missouri, it's a pretty safe bet, you know, that the Democrats would also win Iowa and Ohio. So if I'm the Democratic Party from a strategy standpoint, it's not so much about trying to play defense. It's about trying to be strategic, almost like sniper rifle, like in the way that I try to approach this next election, because I want to take a streamlined type of look and say, there's this many states that if we play things right, you got about 15 and a half months to really build up to this. And the trend have started to be coming a little closer to us. It's not all the way there, but it could be there. If you could even make those states pure toss-ups or super competitive, where the Republicans have to spend so much money in states that they have, frankly, no business having to spend money on, then the Democrats have won, and they will win convincingly again in 2016. And if they can happen to find a way to flip a Missouri, which I think would be the most likely, or maybe flip in Arizona or even a Georgia, then we're talking about a real type of generation-length change in the electoral map in this country. Because now, if the Democrats were to, let's say, win Arizona, they would have California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, the next state on their sights, going through that southwest tour of the country, along with already having the West Coast in Washington and Oregon to go with California. They'd be targeting Texas. And while that might take time, and that may never happen, you would think, in this generation, did you ever think Arizona would even be a thought of for a potential Democratic candidate? You know what I mean? Colorado went Democrat the last two times. New Mexico has frankly become a safe blue state. I mean, just think about that for a second. Imagine if they turned Georgia, and all of a sudden Florida and Georgia and North Carolina and Virginia are blue. South Carolina is frankly not that far away from being a toss-up state itself. I almost could have thrown into the toss-up state into this category if I really, really wanted to. Now you're talking about a Democratic Party that potentially, if they won in Arizona or Georgia, or made them competitive in 2016 and potentially won them in 2020, you're talking about legitimately and literally a party that could potentially own the West Coast and most of the southwest portion of the United States, along with the entire eastern seaboard and east coast of the country. That's a deficit that the Republican Party would struggle to come back from for years and potentially a generation or two. So as you could see, and I hope you could see, even though I'm lacking in visual graphics and everything else, that the road ahead for the Republican Party is very, very difficult. The Democrats have a huge built-in advantage. They have the home field advantage in so many of these key swing states. And they could potentially end up with a candidate that is going to appeal more to white men and white women than Barack Obama did both in 2008 and especially in 2012. While all the while being able to, for the most part, keep those black, Hispanic, and Asian voters franchised, not disenfranchised, but franchised, and get them to turn out in the numbers that they have the past couple of elections for Obama. Frankly, based off of that, seeing the shifts in some of these other states like Arizona Georgia and Missouri, or especially Arizona and Georgia, knowing that Missouri can always be a swing state with the right candidate on the Democratic side, it's very hard to envision a path where the GOP can realistically win this 2016 election. This is how bad it is for the Republican Party. They could win Florida, Ohio, and Virginia and still lose. That's a significant amount of ground they have to make up in one election cycle. It's just not realistic based off the way currently things sit. And then to think on top of that, if somehow a third-party candidate got involved, especially, let's say, a billionaire loudmouth became a third-party candidate, knowing that even if he only got 5, 6, 8% of the vote in most of the states where he had ballot access, especially the swing states, that could really make all the difference, because you could have, similar to Ross Perot in 92 or 96, you go back and look at those electoral maps. The reason Clinton won both of those elections was because Perot was there siphoning off 4 Republican voters to every 1 Democrat voter. And he did it in just enough margin where Clinton could win states. He basically won the entire western Mississippi Valley, and then you throw in Arizona. He won freaking Arizona too, because in part of Perot's presence there. Imagine now, if you take a Republican dream ticket right now, it would probably be Jeb Bush and John Kasich, because they would think it's a real 1-2 punch into Florida and Ohio. Okay, you might think it gives you an upper hand there. It gives you a chance. It most certainly keeps those 2 states in play in a very strong way. But if you've got a Donald Trump peeling off 3% of the vote in Ohio and 5% of the vote in Florida, then that gives you potentially a convincing 8 to 10 point victory when all is said and done, potentially, for a Democrat in those states. And then you start to worry about, with a third-party candidate, if you're the Republicans, that a state like, I can't believe I'm going to say this, states like Mississippi and Alaska and South Carolina end up coming into play. And when you look at numbers, if you get the right type of third-party candidate in there that could get enough support, that's the type of thing that could happen. And then you're talking about a Democratic candidate going from winning potentially 300 electoral votes to 350 electoral votes, to the point where that Democratic candidate could win close to 400 electoral votes. I might not say it's 100% likely, but it is a possibility. And especially with the right third-party candidate who split off from the GOP and brought some of his angry voter base with him, it has a chance of happening. The bottom line is, no matter how much anybody wants to spin there, try to convince me otherwise, or try to fool themselves ultimately into thinking it, the path to victory for the GOP in 2016 doesn't look that good. The math is not there. The electoral map just doesn't bear this out. And when you look at the changing, shifting electorate of the country, and you look at where the Democrats have won, what they've held, where their advantages are, where they could be targeting as opposed to what the GOP can be targeting, unless the Democrats got hit by a bus or the Republicans got gift wrapped some really sweet things for their end to the devastation of the Democratic Party, the Democrats are winning 2016 perhaps by a bigger margin than they did in both 2008 or 2012.